This is the second lecture video for Module 1. The PowerPoint is on environmental science, and this corresponds with Chapter 1 in your textbook. So for the first video, we talked about the field of environmental science and the process of science, or the scientific method. For this video, I will be talking about the environment and sustainability. Also, the environmental ethics and environmental justice issues. So for the environment and sustainability, you need to be able to explain the concept of sustainability and its applications. You also need to be able to describe the concept of environmental equity and provide an example, and then finally define the term ecological footprint. What is it and why do we use it? So in this first slide for sustainability, I included a video from Jane Goodall. So she is one of the first women to go into like the African wilderness to study chimpanzees. Now, she was hired by the primatologist or archaeologist Louis Leakey, and along with Jane Goodall, he hired two other women, one to study gorillas, one to study orangutans. Now, Jane Goodall is by far the most well-known of these three scientists. And she has spent her lifetime, she's in her late 80s, campaigning for originally environmental conservation in Africa, then animal rights, when it comes to using animals in labs. And now she is touring the globe on a book tour to discuss hope and how we can move forward by living a sustainable lifestyle, given things like climate change and all of these environmental issues that we're facing. So I included this video, like I said, because she discusses the concept of sustainability, but she also talks about the fact that there is still hope for us, even though we have very dire environmental issues like global climate change. So I want you to listen to this video on your own time and then think about how you define sustainability. Now, the textbook talks about when the term sustainability first started to be used. So the World Commission on Environmental Development in 1987 published a summary called Our Common Future. And this was a compendium of scientists discussing the state of the world and what sustainability is. So their official definition was that sustainability means development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Also, sustainable development is not a fixed state of harmony, but rather a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the orientation of the technological development, and institutional change are made consistent with the future as well as the present. So what these two definitions mean is that we need to think about our use of resources now and whether or not we are going to leave resources for our children and our grandchildren and future generations. And that summarizes sustainability in broad terms. So let's go to this next slide. There are different ways that you can apply this concept. It can be environmental sustainability, economic, and/or social sustainability. Now, they are all tied to our use of the environment, but they have different implications. So environmental sustainability really just refers to resource use and waste disposal and whether or not our lifestyles are able to be supported by the earth and if future generations could also lead a similar lifestyle. Economic sustainability is slightly different. So that means that all people have access to these resources, right? To purchasing power. And then finally, social sustainability refers to like environmental justice issues. Are marginalized communities more exposed to like hazardous waste or environmental risks? So there are all kinds of things involved in this concept of sustainability. So as you read your book and as you think about this issue, I want you to try to identify examples of environmental, economic, and social sustainability. So let's talk about this term, environmental equity. Well, if you think about the word equity, sounds like equal, right? So environmental equity means that all people have access to the same amount of resources and the same quality of resources, but also that all people share the burden of our current lifestyles, right? We all need food, we all need clothes and places to live. All of these things use resources and create waste. I mean, that is just a fact of life and something you cannot get around. Now, some types of clothing or shelter or food create more waste and use more resources than others. But environmental equity means that we all have access to these resources and that we all share the burden of the waste or pollution that is created. Now, I like this image here, right? Because if you look on the left side, it says equality. So everybody has the same height pedestal, right? However, a really tall person can reach the fruit, whereas a really short person cannot. Now, yes, they're equal. They are all lifted off the ground to the same height, but are they really equal? Some have access to the food they need and others do not. Whereas equity means that all people would have access to the apples, say, regardless of their personal height, meaning that we meet people where they're at, right? We make sure they have access to the necessities that is not dependent on their income or where they live or their ethnicity or race or national origin. None of these things matter in an equitable situation. Everyone would have equal access. Now, as I said before, environmental equity is a part of sustainability, right? We are talking about economic equity, social equity, so it's kind of an all-encompassing term. Now, I remember I went to school in California and I lived in Oakland. A lot of you probably haven't heard of Oakland. It is up near San Francisco. Now, Oakland for a long time was one of the more economically depressed cities in the country, right? It's primarily like minority, low socioeconomic families. And what really struck me when I lived here was that people in Oakland do not have the same access to education that kids do from wealthier areas, that there was one grocery store for the entire city because people did not want to open businesses there because there wasn't as much profit. So this to me is a situation of environmental equity in a way, right? People were forced to shop at corner liquor stores for their food. And a lot of people in Oakland don't own cars. So if you have one grocery store, people are taking a bus, they have kids, they have to carry their groceries back. So this is not an equal situation, right? This is not an equitable situation. And so when I think of this concept, I always think of the time I spent living in this area. Now, there is a concept discussed in your textbook, and this is actually part of your assignment for this week, and that is to calculate your ecological footprint. So let's talk about this concept of an ecological footprint. So what this is this looks at how much land a group of people would use or do use given their consumption, production of goods, and discharge of waste. So for instance, you could calculate an ecological footprint for the US or for Phoenix or for your household. So what it is looking at is how much land and resources are needed to produce the goods that you use, and how much land and resources are needed to dispose of your waste. Now, an ecological footprint is a really good way to compare the lifestyles and consumption patterns of people from different areas. And as you probably have guessed, the US has one of the highest ecological footprints in the world, right? Because, I mean, let's face it, we, economically speaking, are a very well-off country, and we have high consumption patterns. So now, if you look at this image that I put on the slide, what it is showing you here on the bottom is from our fisheries, we get seafood. From our cropland and pastures, we get food and fiber, right? We're raising cows so we can eat meat. Forest, we get timber and paper. This has built up land. So basically that's room for us to settle and build cities. And then finally, our carbon footprint is a reflection of our energy use, right? When we produce energy, we are releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So the ecological footprint is looking at how fast nature can absorb our waste and generate new resources. Now, for your assignment, like I said, I gave you a Word document, and I want you to put your answers into the Word document that I gave you. And you are going to take a ecological footprint quiz. You're going to put in your information, and the results basically show you how many planets we would need to support our human population if everyone consumed as you do. Okay. So now let's look at environmental ethics. So what I want you to understand or be able to show after this section of the module is you need to be able to describe the frontier ethic, sustainable ethic, and land ethic that have been dominant in the US. I would like you to be able to provide an example for each type of ethic, and then you also need to describe what the tragedy of the commons is and provide an example. So first we have the frontier ethic. Now, this ethic really came into play when people were settling across the country, right? We're on the East Coast, cities are being built, and resources are being used up. And as these resources were used up, people started to move west, right? There was a big migration to California and areas like that. So the frontier ethic, people who believe in this believe that natural resources are unlimited, right? So things like soil, healthy soil is unlimited, but it's not actually unlimited. The frontier ethic also says that humans are masters of their environment. Economic growth is a measure of a healthy society. And this one really strikes me as not sustainable in the sense that we cannot keep going in this direction. But economic growth basically means like to increase the number of jobs in the country or to increase our production. But there has to be a cutoff point, right? We can't just keep growing without serious repercussions. Now, the question I ask you here is, what does the term anthropocentric mean? So anthro basically means human. So anthropocentric means that the frontier ethic is really focused on humans. How can we use the environment? Now, the sustainable ethic, according to this ethic, natural resources are limited. And we share resources with other living things, meaning that we have to conserve some of our resources. Now, the sustainable ethic, people believe that growth is not sustainable, right? You cannot grow indefinitely, meaning by people or economically or production. These things cannot go on indefinitely. Now, part of the sustainable ethic is that humans are a part of nature and that humans, our communities, do best when we keep environmental processes in place. So what that means, so an environmental process, like I mentioned in the last video, would be like pollination. Another environmental process would be water purification. As water trickles down through soil into the water table, a lot of chemicals are filtered out, right? So if we destroy these processes so that they no longer occur, we will have to carry out these things on our own using technology or human labor, right? If we don't have pollinators, which actually has occurred in China, they have seen such a decline in their bee populations that they actually have to hand pollinate apple trees, meaning you take a paintbrush to a flower, get a pollen grain, take that pollen grain, put it on another flower to produce fruit. So as these processes start to fall apart, we have to pick up the slack, right? If we don't have the purification capabilities of soil, which in a lot of places we don't, we have to purify everything through our water treatment plants, right? There is no recharging of wells and things like that with healthy water, I should say, with clean water. So the sustainable ethic is still anthropocentric, right? It is still focused on humans, but it acknowledges that we are a part of nature and that we rely on nature. Now, this last concept is the land ethic. Now, this was first introduced by Aldo Leopold. There he is in the picture. He wrote about the land ethic in a Sand County Almanac. And this is one of the early and most influential environmental publications. Now, Aldo Leopold argued that seeing the environment and resources as our property is unethical, that species and nature should be valued just because it exists. And it is not dependent on whether or not we have a use for it. It is not dependent on whether it maintains processes that we need. Everything has value just because it is here. Now we are going to apply this to a case study of Hetch Hetchy Valley. Now this is around Yosemite in California. I'm going to be posting a discussion where you will watch a video and answer some questions about Hetch Hetchy Valley and apply the different ethics. So the book discusses the Hetch Hetchy Valley. Now, basically, this dispute over this valley occurred in 1913. So at the time, the public was becoming concerned with the rate of deforestation. And what happened is they are proposing that a dam be put into the valley, which would have flooded it with water. Now, two groups arose from the so-called conservation movement. One was considered utilitarian conservation, and the other group were called preservationists. So the utilitarian conservation group was headed by Gifford Pinchot, who was the chief forester under Teddy Roosevelt. Now, he believed that conservation of resources should be done when it profits the public, right? So both the utilitarian group and the preservationist group, neither of these groups believed that resources were unlimited, right? But the utilitarian group followed the rest of the tenets of the frontier ethic. So this group under Gifford Pinchot believed that nature is valuable as long as it can benefit humans, right? Its value is based on the benefits that it provided to humans. Now, the preservationists were led by John Muir. Now, he's like a really well-known person or name in California. You generally don't hear about him as much here. But he followed the land ethic of Aldo Leopold, and he believed that forests and other wilderness areas should be preserved just because they have inherent value. So both of these groups were arguing over whether a dam should be put into this valley. So a quote by Gifford Pinchot is that the fundamental principle of the whole conservation policy is that of use, to take every part of land and its resources and put it to that use in which it will serve the most people. Now, John Muir, on the other hand, a quote from him is that these temple destroyers, devotees of ravaging commercialism, seem to have a perfect contempt for nature, and instead of lifting their eyes to the God of the mountains, lift them to the almighty dollar. So after much debate over whether the dam should be put in place, the preservationists eventually lost the battle, and the river was dammed going through the Hetch Hetchy Valley. The one good thing to come out of this, depending on your perspective, is that Congress passed the National Park System Organic Act in 1916. And so what that says is that areas that are designated as national parks have to be maintained in a manner that does not impair them for future generations. So as I said, you're going to be doing a discussion board on this. Oops. There it is. So you are going to watch this video, has Harrison Ford in it. And what I want you to think about is whether you support removing the dam and why or why not. And so you are going to contribute to the discussion post based on the different ethics that we've discussed and your personal opinion. Now, one of the last names for this PowerPoint, in addition to environmental justice, is this discussion of the tragedy of the commons. So this whole concept was written about by Garrett Hardin in an essay that he called The Tragedy of the Commons. And so what this is, it's looking at what happens to resources when nobody owns them, when everyone has access to a given resource. Now, in the essay, he provided an example. So let's say there is a pasture, nobody owns it, it's open to all of the different herdsmen. Now, the way that the essay puts it is any rational herdsman will keep as many cattle as possible in this pasture to maximize his gain. So he will keep increasing and increasing the number of cattle because that maximizes his profit, right? And there are no immediate consequences. But every herdsman who has access to this pasture does the same thing, adds more and more cattle to maximize their profit, until eventually the pasture is so degraded that no one can use it. And now no one has the ability to make money by raising cattle. Now, we have seen this situation over and over again. Some examples would be like overgrazing of public land, which we've seen a lot of here in the Southwest, overuse of forests, overfishing, right? So no one country owns a lot of these fishing areas. And so we're all going in there trying to take as many fish as possible. And we've seen the decline or total depletion of fish populations. Now, the atmosphere is also considered a common, right? We all need it. We all breathe oxygen. We need the different gases that are in the atmosphere, but we are all contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And eventually we will all pay the price when it comes to global climate change. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this section, you need to understand what is meant by tragedy of the commons, and you need to be able to provide an example. I would prefer you provide an example other than the cows in the pasture. Now, the last section for this PowerPoint and this module is environmental justice. So you need to know what the concept of environmental justice means and also how it can apply and affect Indigenous communities. So I wrote a definition out on the slide, and it is very similar to what you're given in your book. But basically, it refers to the fair treatment and also the opportunity for meaningful involvement for all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, national origin, socioeconomic status, etc. So it sounds very similar to environmental equity, right? The difference is environmental equity can apply to, say, resource use, but environmental justice means that everybody has to have say in what environmental regulations are passed and how they are enforced. And by having a say, I mean that we need to recognize representatives of all the different communities when we form these regulations and laws and reinforcement. Now, this is very applicable and, well, it's very applicable to problems faced by Indigenous communities. So I wrote here, do you belong to a community or do you know someone who does that has faced an environmental justice situation? Now, your text goes into the attitudes of different cultures about sustainability and how those compare to the US. Now, I put according to your text, and I want you to read about it. One of the things that struck me when I was reading this part of the textbook is that I was wondering if some of the quotes from Indigenous leaders, let's say, or the attitudes, the summarized attitudes of Indigenous cultures are accurate, right? And so I'm really curious to hear your feedback, and I will open a discussion board or include a couple of questions on this as well. So I'm interested, especially from those of you who come from Indigenous communities, as to whether the belief system and the attitudes towards nature that are, mainstream white culture ascribe to your community. According to the text, though, it is really like our white European communities, descendants of Europeans here in the US that have a utilitarian ethic towards nature, that we are kind of the masters of nature and it's valuable because of what it can provide to us. And I do think that is largely true, that a lot of people in our society do feel that way. And the way that, say, some Native American groups are referred to is that, this holistic approach where everything is considered part of one large community. And I'm not saying that isn't true. I just wonder if that is accurate or if that is just our ideas being, white mainstream culture of how other groups feel. So that is just something to think about as you read your text. Now, that is the end of this PowerPoint. So I would like you to go back and watch the videos that I've embedded in the PowerPoint and to review your textbook so that you can apply some of the learning objectives that I gave you.